The battle had raged on for hours. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground trembled beneath the feet of soldiers from both sides. Explosions echoed in the distance, and the clash of weapons rang out through the chaos. Amid the destruction, there was a momentary silence, a brief lull in the conflict as the last of the enemy forces retreated. James stood tall, his body covered in dirt and sweat, his armor battered from the fighting. His eyes scanned the battlefield, his mind still sharp despite the exhaustion that crept in. As one of the most experienced soldiers in the unit, he had seen his fair share of bloodshed, but today had been different. Today, he had been part of a victory that felt hollow. The alien enemy had been formidable, but it wasn't just the battle that weighed on him. It was the aftermath. "Choose your prize, soldier," barked his commanding officer, a gruff voice cutting through the air. "The spoils of war are ours for the taking. Pick one." James glanced around, noting the other soldiers already eagerly picking through the wreckage. Some claimed powerful alien weapons, others took trophies from fallen warriors, armor, skulls, anything that might serve as a reminder of the battle. But James wasn't like the others. His gaze shifted to a group of prisoners that had been gathered off to the side. These were the captured aliens, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies bruised from the fighting. It was then that his eyes fell on her. She was small compared to the others, her pale skin almost translucent, her long black hair tangled from the battle. Her eyes, though, were what captured his attention. There was something about them, an intensity that seemed to pierce through him, as if she were seeing something he couldn't. The other soldiers scoffed at her. She looked weak, defenseless even. She had no armor, no weapons, just her frail form. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she held herself that made James pause. He knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. "I'll take her," James said, his voice steady but firm. The soldiers around him stopped, laughing at his choice. A few even shook their heads. "Really, James? You want her?" One soldier sneered. "She looks like a twig. You could have picked one of the big ones, those fighters. This one? She's useless." But James didn't respond. He simply walked over to the prisoner, his heavy boots crunching on the ground as he approached her. The alien looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. James knelt down in front of her, his helmet casting a shadow over his face. "You're coming with me," he said softly. The alien nodded slowly, not speaking. James could tell she was trying to understand why he had chosen her, but something in her eyes made him believe she wasn't entirely helpless. With a gesture, he signaled to the guards, and they uncuffed her, allowing her to stand. The other prisoners were left behind as James led her away, the murmurs and laughter of his fellow soldiers fading behind them. As they made their way toward the transport ship, James could feel the weight of the situation. The others might have seen her as just another prisoner, another trophy to add to their collection, but he saw something more. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he trusted his instincts. He had been in enough battles to recognize when there was more at play than met the eye. The journey back to the base was long and silent. James didn't speak to her, and she didn't speak to him. She simply followed, her footsteps light but determined. There was an aura of mystery about her, an energy he couldn't explain. When they finally boarded the ship, James led her to a small holding room. The others might have taken their prizes to the barracks, but James wanted to keep her separate from the rest. He wasn't sure why, but it felt right. As he closed the door behind him, he looked at her again, studying her features closely. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." She glanced at him but didn't respond. She was still, almost eerily so, as if she were waiting for something, waiting for him to do something. Her silence was both unnerving and fascinating. James sat down at the small table in the room, resting his chin on his hand as he thought. His fellow soldiers had chosen trophies. They had chosen strength, weapons, and power. But he had chosen her. There was more to her than anyone realized, and he was going to find out what that was. The ship hummed softly as they sped toward the base. The distance between them and the rest of the galaxy seemed to stretch on forever. James could feel the weight of his choice pressing on him, but he wasn't second-guessing himself. He had made his decision, and now it was time to understand why. He glanced back at the alien, Lyra, as he had learned from her identification tags. She was standing by the window, her eyes gazing out at the stars. James couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. What kind of life had she led before all of this? Who was she really? The door to the room slid open, and one of the ship's crew members entered, breaking his thoughts. "We're approaching the base, sir," the crew member said with a salute. James nodded, standing up. "Good. Let's get her settled, and make sure she's treated with respect. No rough handling." The crew member looked surprised but nodded obediently before exiting. As the ship landed, James followed Lyra out into the docking bay. The base was large, bustling with activity as soldiers and officers went about their business. But all James could focus on was her, the alien he had chosen. In the days that followed, he kept her close. He made sure she was well fed and treated with dignity, something that made her stand out even more among the other prisoners. James wasn't sure why, but he felt a deep sense of protectiveness toward her, a feeling that had never quite surfaced with any other prisoner he had encountered. But it wasn't just his protective instinct. There was something else. A connection. Perhaps. He couldn't place it, but he was beginning to realize that this useless alien was far more than he had initially believed, and he was determined to find out just what made her so special. The days at the base passed slowly, with James keeping to his routine. The war was over, the battles won, but his mind never stopped racing. Lyra, the alien he had chosen, remained an enigma. Her silence was both unsettling and captivating. He couldn't help but wonder about her past, about what had made her different from the other prisoners. She was not the fierce warrior that many of the others were. But James had learned long ago not to judge by appearances. He was certain there was something more to her than met the eye. It was late in the evening when the first sign of her hidden power came. James had just finished his patrol around the perimeter of the base when he walked past Lyra's room. He paused when he noticed a strange glow emanating from under the door. The lights were off inside, yet the room was filled with a soft, eerie light. His heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her use any form of energy or power before, but something about the room told him she was up to something. Quietly, he knocked. "Lyra, you in there?" The glow faded instantly and the room grew dark again. He waited for a moment, then opened the door. Lyra stood by the window, her back to him. She was motionless, her long black hair cascading down her back. But something was different this time. Her eyes were wide open, reflecting the stars outside. There was a quiet intensity about her. "Are you okay?" James asked, stepping inside cautiously. Lyra didn't respond, but she didn't need to. He could see it in her face, the calmness, the sense of control. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't weak. But what had she done? James moved toward her, his footsteps soft. He reached out to touch her shoulder, a gentle gesture, but before his hand could make contact, he felt something strange in the air. A subtle shift, like the very atmosphere around him had changed. The air seemed to thicken, like a pressure building up around them. Lyra turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. They were filled with an emotion he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't fear or anger, it was something deeper, almost as if she were challenging him, daring him to discover her truth. Then, without warning, a pulse of energy shot from her body. It was brief, just a flash, but it sent a shockwave through the room. The windows rattled and the lights flickered on and off. James stumbled backward, instinctively raising his hands to shield himself, but the blast didn't harm him. It was as if the power had simply brushed past him, a warning. Lyra stood perfectly still, her face calm once again, as if nothing had happened. The energy she had released faded, and the room returned to normal. James blinked in disbelief. "What was that?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and confusion. Lyra finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I did not mean to show you, but you needed to see." James took a step forward, his mind racing. He had known there was more to her than met the eye. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. What kind of power did she possess? What are you? James whispered, more to himself than to her. Lyra turned fully toward him now. Her eyes seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment James felt as though she could read his every thought. I am the last of my kind, she said quietly. My people once ruled the stars, but they were destroyed. My power, my legacy, has been hidden for my safety. James swallowed hard. He had heard stories of powerful ancient races in the galaxy, but this was something entirely different. He had never imagined he would encounter one. But here she was, standing before him, the last of her kind, and she had just demonstrated abilities that most beings could only dream. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. James found himself caught between two worlds, the life of a soldier, following orders, going to war, and the strange, mysterious existence of Lyra, the alien he had rescued from the battlefield. She wasn't just any prisoner. She was something much more powerful, something hidden beneath the surface. Lyra had agreed to teach him, to show him the truth about her people and her abilities, but James wasn't sure if he was ready. Every time they spoke, he learned more, yet each revelation left him with more questions. There were layers to Lyra's existence that he could never have imagined, and every layer revealed something far beyond what he had anticipated. One evening, as the stars twinkled outside the base's observation deck, James sat with Lyra, her gaze distant as she stared out at the vastness of space. I need you to understand. Lyra's voice broke the silence. My people were not just powerful warriors. We were more than that. We were the keepers of knowledge, of ancient secrets. Our race was the first to explore the stars, to understand the forces that bind the universe together. James listened intently, his mind racing with the weight of her words. He had always thought of aliens in simple terms, enemies, allies, or just creatures from distant planets. But Lyra's people were different. They had been the first to touch the stars, to understand things that humanity hadn't even begun to explore. But then the war came. Lyra continued, her voice tinged with sorrow. The galaxy was divided, torn apart by greed and power. Our kind was seen as a threat. They said we had too much knowledge, too much power. So they wiped us out. My people were hunted one by one, until only a few of us remained. James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had heard of wars between alien species before, conflicts fought over resources, territory, or dominance. But he hadn't known that a race as ancient and powerful as Lyra's could be destroyed so easily, simply because of their knowledge. The idea seemed absurd, yet here she was, the last of her kind, hiding in plain sight. But why didn't you fight back? James asked, his voice full of disbelief. You're so powerful. You could have fought back. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. We did fight, but they were too many. The ones who came after us were not just soldiers. They were mercenaries, hired by the powerful factions who feared us, and our power. It was not something we could use recklessly. It required balance, discipline. The more we used it, the more we risked destroying ourselves. James frowned, trying to understand. He had seen Lyra's power, the brief flash of energy she had released. It was immense, undeniable. But there was a limit to it. He could sense that much. She wasn't fully embracing her abilities, holding back for reasons he didn't yet understand. What is it that you're afraid of? James asked softly. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time, James saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I'm not afraid of them, she replied. I'm afraid of myself. My people were destroyed because of our power. I can feel it inside me, growing stronger every day. If I let it go unchecked, I could become what they feared. I could become the very thing that destroyed my people. James nodded slowly, understanding more than he had before. Lyra wasn't just hiding from the enemies who had destroyed her people. She was hiding from herself. from the possibility that one day her powers might overwhelm her, just as they had with her ancestors. "You don't have to be afraid," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm here to help you. You don't have to face this alone." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something in his words. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she finally said, "You don't understand, James. My kind was not meant to survive. We were the keepers of the universe's secrets, and when we fell, we took those secrets with us. The galaxy is safer without us. I am the last of a race that was too dangerous for the universe to allow to exist." James shook his head, refusing to accept her words. "The galaxy doesn't decide who deserves to survive. You do. You're not just a weapon. You're a person, Lyra. And I believe you can control your power. You don't have to be what they thought you would be." Lyra stood up, walking over to the window. The light from the stars bathed her in a soft glow, making her seem almost ethereal. She was quiet for a moment, as if contemplating his words. "You believe in me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "I do. I've seen your power, and I know you can control it. You're not a weapon. You're a person with a future." Lyra turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "And if I can't control it? If I become the thing I fear?" James took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever happens, I won't leave you. You're not alone in this." For the first time, Lyra's expression softened, and James saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. The fear that had been so evident in her gaze began to fade, replaced by a quiet trust. "Thank you, James," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. James smiled, though he knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. He had no idea what the future held for him or for Lyra, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. They were in this together, whether she realized it or not. The days that followed were filled with more training. Lyra began to show James the true extent of her abilities. He had seen the flashes of power before, but now he was learning how controlled and precise it could be. She could manipulate energy, move objects with just a thought, and even heal herself from injuries that would have killed most people. But still, there was fear in her eyes, a fear of losing control, of becoming a weapon. James, however, was determined to help her. He spent hours with her, encouraging her, showing her that she could control her power. Slowly but surely, Lyra began to trust herself again, to believe that she could use her abilities for good. One evening, as the two of them trained in the quiet of the base, something unexpected happened. Lyra's powers surged once more, but this time, instead of an uncontrolled explosion, she focused the energy, shaping it into a sphere of light in her hands. It hovered there, glowing brightly as she stared at it in awe. "I did it," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You did? I knew you could." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and gratitude. I think I'm ready." James nodded. "Ready for what?" "To face whatever comes next," she said, her voice filled with determination. "And to stop running from who I really am." James felt a surge of pride for her. She had come a long way, and now, more than ever, he believed in her. "You're not running anymore," he said quietly. "You're leading, and I'll be right beside you every step of the way." And for the first time in a long while, Lyra smiled, genuinely from the heart. She had found a way to embrace her past, her power, and her future. And with James by her side, she knew that anything was possible. The days at the base were becoming more tense. James could feel it in the air, the whispers, the glances, the suspicion. More and more soldiers were beginning to take notice of the strange alien he had chosen. Some were curious, others were wary, and a few were downright hostile. They had seen her powers, felt the raw energy she had unleashed once before, and now they were wondering what James was hiding. What was so special about Lyra that he had kept her isolated, kept her away from the others? James kept his distance from the others. He had been assigned new duties, and most of his time was spent working with Lyra, continuing her training. He had promised her that he would help her control her powers, but even he was beginning to wonder if he had bitten off more than he could chew. Lyra was powerful, far more powerful than any of them realized. And with that power came a dangerous temptation. James had always been a soldier. He had fought for honor, for duty, for what he believed was right. But now he was caught in a world of secrets, of lies, and of forces that were far beyond his understanding. He had seen the way the others looked at him and at Lyra. They saw her as a threat, and they feared what she could do. But James knew better. He knew that Lyra wasn't a weapon. She was someone who had been broken, someone who had been hiding from her own power for far too long. One evening, as James returned to his quarters after a long day, he found something he hadn't expected. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and inside he could hear voices. "She can't be allowed to live," one voice was saying. "She's too dangerous." James's heart skipped a beat. The voice belonged to Commander Larkin, the head of the base's security division. Larkin had always been suspicious of James's relationship with Lyra, but this was something different. "I know," another voice replied, lower and more insistent. "But we can't just kill her. Not yet. We need her. We need to understand her power, and then we can control it." James's blood ran cold. They were talking about Lyra, about using her power for their own gain. They didn't see her as a person, they saw her as a tool, a weapon to be controlled and exploited. He had been afraid of this, but hearing it out loud made the threat real. The people at the base had no intention of letting Lyra live in peace. They wanted to use her, manipulate her, and if necessary, destroy her. James took a deep breath and stepped into the room, his boots clicking softly on the floor. The two men inside turned sharply as he entered. Commander Larkin's expression hardened immediately. The quiet hum of the base was deafening. James could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he pulled Lyra along through the darkened hallways. Every corner was filled with tension. He could feel the eyes of soldiers and officers on him, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was getting Lyra to safety. They moved swiftly, staying in the shadows as they made their way toward the back exit of the base. James knew that they didn't have much time. Larkin and the others were already searching for them, and if they were caught, there would be no telling what the military would do to Lyra. They wouldn't treat her like the person she was. They would treat her like a weapon to be used, controlled, and ultimately destroyed. James wouldn't let that happen, not while he still had a breath in his body. As they reached the back door, Lyra stopped. She turned to him, her eyes filled with worry. "Where will we go?" she asked softly, her voice full of uncertainty. James looked down at her, taking a deep breath. "I don't know yet, but I promise. We'll find somewhere safe. There's a group of rebels, freedom fighters, who operate in the outer colonies. They don't trust the Empire or the military, and they might be able to help us." Lyra nodded, but there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. "Do you trust them?" she asked. James hesitated. It was a fair question. He had met the rebels once during a mission a few years back, and he hadn't been impressed. They were disorganized, at times reckless, but they were one of the few groups that actively resisted the Empire. And right now they were their best shot. "I trust them more than I trust the people we're running from," he said firmly. Lyra didn't say anything else. She just nodded, her face serious. She was afraid, but there was something else in her eyes now, something stronger than fear. It was determination. She was ready to fight just as he was. The door creaked open, and they slipped out into the night. The moonlight cast long shadows over the base, and the sound of distant engines hummed in the air. They moved quickly, keeping to the edges of the compound, avoiding the patrols that might be out looking for them. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the edge of the base, where the transport ships were docked. James spotted the small civilian ship he had arranged to take them. It wasn't much, but it would get them to the colonies. That was all they needed. As they approached the ship, James spotted a figure in the shadows, one of the rebels. It was a tall, wiry man with sharp features, his face hidden beneath a hood. He was standing by the ramp of the ship waiting for them. "You made it," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to get past the guards." James stepped forward, nodding. "We're ready. Let's go." Rebel glanced at Lyra, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he turned back to James. "You sure you want to bring her with you? She's not just another refugee. The Empire has eyes everywhere. If they find out she's with you—" "We don't have a choice," James interrupted. "We're in this together. If you help us, we'll owe you." The rebel hesitated, but after a long moment he nodded. "All right, but we'll have to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that someone will catch on to us." They boarded the ship, and the ramp sealed behind them with a soft hiss. The rebel made his way to the controls, and the engines hummed to life. As the ship lifted off from the base, James watched through the small window as the lights of the compound grew smaller and smaller. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The military would come after them, but they couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. They had to keep moving forward no matter what. The journey to the outer colonies was long, and the trip was not without its challenges. The ship was small, barely capable of jumping between star systems without drawing attention. They had to take a few detours, avoiding any ships that might be watching. But after days of travel, they finally arrived at their destination. A small, forgotten colony on the edge of the galaxy, a place where the Empire's reach was weaker. The colony was a ragged place. The buildings were worn down, and the people looked tired, their eyes wary. This was no utopia. It was a place of survival. But it was a place where they could be safe. For now. James and Lyra disembarked, the harsh winds of the planet's surface biting at their skin. The rebel led them down a narrow alleyway past buildings that seemed to sag with age. James could feel the tension in the air. There was something about this place that made him uneasy. But he couldn't let that stop him. They had made it this far, and they would keep moving forward. The rebel stopped in front of a large metal door and knocked 3 times. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room inside. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by a dark scarf. "James," the rebel said, "this is the contact. He's the one who can help you." James nodded and stepped forward, holding out his hand. "I'm looking for a safe place for her. She's not just a refugee. She's—" He paused, not sure how to explain what Lyra really was. He didn't have the words for it. "She's important." The man in the doorway studied Lyra for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. "Follow me," he said in a low voice. They followed the man through the dark hallways of the building. James could sense Lyra's nervousness beside him. She had been through so much already, and now they were asking for help from people they barely knew. It wasn't the kind of situation she was used to. Finally, they reached a small room at the back of the building. The man turned to face them, his expression serious. "You can stay here for a while," he said. "But this is a temporary solution. The Empire won't ignore us forever. They'll come looking for you, and when they do, you need to be ready." James looked at Lyra, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that neither of them had ever experienced before. "Are you ready?" James asked her, his voice quiet. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I think I am." The man nodded. "Then we'll begin. The first step is to make sure the Empire doesn't find you here. You can't stay hidden forever, but for now you're safe." James and Lyra both knew it wouldn't last. The Empire would come for them sooner or later. But for now they had a brief moment of peace. And in that moment, James realized something important. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting. They were fighting for their future, for Lyra's future, and no matter what the galaxy threw at them, they would face it together. The days passed slowly on the colony. James and Lyra had found some peace, but it was a fragile kind. The Empire was always out there, waiting, watching. They could never relax for long, knowing that any day could bring danger. The rebels in the colony had helped them hide, but even they could only do so much. It wasn't enough to erase the constant worry in James's mind. Lyra had been training with the rebel fighters, learning how to harness her abilities without causing harm. She had come a long way since they first met, her power no longer a dangerous, wild force. But the fear still lingered in her eyes when she practiced, the fear of losing control, of becoming the very thing she had been running from all her life. James watched her train, his heart full of admiration. She was stronger than she knew, not just because of the power she held, but because of the courage she had shown. Every day she pushed herself harder, not for glory or power, but to protect those she cared about. But there was only so much time before the Empire would come. And when they did, it wouldn't matter how much power Lyra had learned to control. The Empire would stop at nothing to destroy her. One morning, as James and Lyra stood outside their makeshift hideout, looking out at the small city, a familiar cold feeling washed over James. His instincts were telling him something wasn't right. He turned to Lyra, his voice urgent. "They're here." Lyra's eyes widened, her heart racing. "How do you know?" James clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "I can feel it. The Empire is closing in on us." Before Lyra could respond, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. The distant sound of alarms echoed across the colony. James's heart sank as he grabbed Lyra's arm. "Get inside now," he ordered. They rushed back into the building where the rebels were already mobilizing, readying themselves for battle. The calm that had settled over them in the past few weeks was shattered. The Empire had come, and this time, they wouldn't stop until they found Lyra. James's mind raced as he gave orders to the rebels. They had no time to waste. The enemy was powerful, and they had no way of knowing how many troops were coming. All they had was a small force of rebels, some weapons, and Lyra's power. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Lyra stood by his side, her face pale. She had never been in a battle like this before, but she wasn't going to hide anymore. Not when the people she cared about were at risk. She had already spent too much of her life running. "I can help," she said, her voice steady, though the fear in her eyes was still there. "I can protect us." James nodded, his gaze intense. "I know you can. But we need to work together. This isn't just about you anymore." The rebels set up a defensive perimeter around the hideout, positioning themselves strategically as they prepared for the fight. James and Lyra stood at the front, watching as the enemy closed in. The ground shook again, this time with the sound of approach.